Hi, I'm Peter Tragos, host of the Lawyer You Know podcast and YouTube channel. The saying goes, everyone hates lawyers until you need one. Well, I'm here when you need one to answer your questions and give you insight that you didn't know you needed. Welcome back to the Lawyer You Know, and today we are going to unpack the facts one more time on this Ronnie O'Neal trial, and today we're going to talk about the recommendation made by the jury in the sentencing phase. And to start this video, and if you're wondering how Ronnie O'Neal reacted to this and what he thought about this sentencing phase and about this entire trial, don't miss it at the very beginning of this video. But we're going to start the video by watching exactly what happened in court, and we'll react as it goes. Stay till the end, because we're going to get Big George's thoughts once again. We're going to bring him in, ask him what he thought about the jury's verdict, ask him to explain it a little bit more. There were some confusing aspects of it. I think it's easier to explain after we've watched this video. And make sure you get your questions for him in the comments so we can make sure we keep this rolling. Subscribe to our page so you don't miss any lives we may do in the future on this case or other cases. And like this video if you like this content. We really appreciate it. Let's jump into the video.
If you answer yes to at least one of the aggravating factors listed in Section A or Section B, please proceed to Section C. C, sufficiency of the aggravating factors. 1, reviewing the aggravating factors that we unanimously found to be established beyond a reasonable doubt in Section A, as they apply to Kenyatta Barron. We, the jury, unanimously find the aggravating factors are sufficient to warrant a possible sentence of death. Yes. 2, reviewing the aggravating factors that we unanimously found to be established beyond a reasonable doubt in Section B, as they apply to Ronnie O'Neal. We, the jury, unanimously find the aggravating factors are sufficient to warrant a possible sentence of death. Yes. D, mitigating circumstances. One or more individual jurors find that one or more mitigating circumstances was established by the greater weight of the evidence. Yes. Eligibility for the death penalty for count 1, Kenyatta Barron. We, the jury, unanimously find that the aggravating factors that were proven beyond a reasonable doubt in Section A outweigh the mitigating circumstances established Section D above as to count 1. No. F, eligibility for the death penalty for count 2, Ronnie O'Neal. We, the jury, unanimously find that the aggravating factors that were proven beyond a reasonable doubt in Section B outweigh the mitigating circumstances established Section D above as to count 2. No.
Do you notice the look on his face? He almost looks surprised when he looks over at the jury trying to figure out what they're doing when the verdict came down no, that the aggravating factors did not outweigh the mitigating factors. He looked at him like this. You know, as we go throughout the process, we heard them talk a lot about the aggravating factors, and the one that stuck out that we didn't talk about in the live already was the fact that he had been convicted of a prior violent felony. Okay, unanimously they decided that that was true and applies as an aggravating factor. All the other aggravating factors that they applied to his death penalty phase recommendation, we talked about. You know, aggravated child abuse, minor children, vulnerable children, cruel and unusual. So all those applied. But the one that was surprising, and I shouldn't say surprising, just unknown to us at the time, was that he had a violent crime in his past. I think that may change the way you all look at Ronnie O'Neal and this penalty phase, because as we were talking in the live, a lot of questions about whether he had any prior criminal history, a lot of questions about his life and what he was like before he got here. Was this just a one-off, one time he ever did anything wrong in his life? Doesn't sound like that. It seems like there may have been a violent history in Ronnie O'Neal's past, and that may have contributed to these aggravating factors. But if you heard, they said, do those aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors as to count 1? No. That no means they're not going to recommend death. They are going to recommend a life sentence because they could not come to a unanimous decision on death. Let's listen to a little bit more.
If your vote to impose death is less than unanimous, the trial court shall impose a sentence of life without the possibility of parole.
So there's our answer. If, and there's a couple key words that are important. If the decision for death is not unanimous, and again, that's some of the confusion because the case law says that 7-5 would have been enough. But the statute, the legislature says in the statutes that it has to be unanimous. When my dad comes on, he'll explain that a little bit more like he explained it before. But this decision had to be unanimous because it's weighing aggravating factors versus mitigating factors. And if you don't come to a unanimous decision for death, the court shall impose a sentence of life without parole. Shall is a very important word because all throughout the statutes and the case law, there's different discretion given to judges on what decisions they may make, or it removes the discretion and says they shall make certain decisions based on facts, based on what happens, based on jury recommendations. And this is not one that says the judge may impose a life sentence, because that would infer that the judge may also impose a death sentence. This is one that says the judge shall impose a sentence of life. Okay, so because they did not unanimously recommend the death penalty on count 1, the judge shall impose a sentence of life.
Dated this 25th day of June, 2021, signed by the foreperson. All right, I'm now going to poll the jury. And again, I'm going to do it by initials and juror number, okay?
A lot of you also pointed out the fact that some of the jurors' names were mentioned in some of the other videos. I don't know if the court wasn't ready or the news stations aren't following their rules or whatever, but I heard them too. We didn't necessarily say them again on our broadcast, but when we talk about the fact that now the judge is saying just juror initials as she polls the jury, that's the right move. That's how it should be done.
Juror number, okay? Members of the jury, we are going...
Then you see Ronnie O'Neal give the 2 thumbs up to his lawyers, and you'll see the camera pan to the lawyers. They're obviously happy because they technically won this penalty phase. There was only 2 options. Option A is death. Option B is life. A would be a loss for his public defenders. B would be a win. So technically they won. The portion of the trial he used his standby counsel as public defenders, they won this portion of the trial.
Members of the jury, we are going to ask each of you individually about the verdict that you have just heard. The question pertains to whether the verdict, as read by myself, was correctly stated. Beginning with juror number 1, initials LR.
So as they poll the jury, which we've already explained that in lots of cases, why they poll the jury, why it's important, because we got to make sure this is every single juror's verdict, right? But usually it's, are you unanimous in your decision for guilty, or are you unanimous in your decision for not guilty in a criminal trial? But this one, listen to the verbiage that the judge reads because it's very important. We don't necessarily get to hear what every juror said or every juror voted. Listen to the question that she asks each juror. We're just going to hear it once so we don't have to hear it over and over again. But listen to this question. It's very important.
Do you, juror number 1, initials LR, agree that at least one member of the jury voted for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole?
So the question was very specific. Do you agree that at least one juror voted for life imprisonment without the ability of parole, meaning instead of the death penalty? And if the answer to that is yes, it's over. There's no death penalty. If one juror doesn't, because it has to be unanimous. Okay, we'll explain more on that later. But it's a very interesting concept that that's the question asked by the judge when polling the jury. Okay, so it's not the same as it is in other criminal cases, and that's very interesting in this penalty phase. So we talked a lot in the live, and we talked a lot with you all already about whether you think life is appropriate or death is appropriate. In this situation, they came back with life. So we'll see more in the comments if you guys agree with that or not. But I think based on this jury's verdict, okay, based on their recommendation, they felt those mitigating factors were actually significant. And I think those mitigating factors came into play when weighing them against the aggravating factors to where life without parole is punishment enough for the crimes that he's convicted of. Now, I don't know if you're going to agree or not, but some other people are saying that maybe the jury felt like life without parole is actually a worse sentence than death. I mean, we talked throughout our live. I mean, we had thousands of people involved in our lives, and I love all your comments. That's why this is so important, because it makes stuff make sense to us, the lawyers, to everybody watching. We had people on all sides of the spectrum commenting that life is way too light of a punishment. He needs to have death. We had people commenting that life is worse than death. I'd rather have death than life. We had people commenting that there's no way he deserves death. We have to give him life, right? So all across the spectrum, there were different thoughts and feelings by all of you who are potential jurors. You could have been sitting on this jury if you live in Hillsborough County. You could have been sitting on this jury or whatever county that you live in, and you could be making decisions like this. So it's important to hear what all of you think. All opinions are important. Just keep them as respectful as you can in the comments, because they let me know. Keep them pointed to what we're asking, because they let me know what lay people, what potential jurors think about these situations. And some people may think vastly differently, but every vote counts in this situation in Florida because it must be unanimous, and they could not come into an agreement unanimously on death, which in my opinion means the mitigating factors worked, and therefore his lawyers did a good enough job presenting that evidence in this penalty phase to get him life without parole as opposed to death. But now let's hear what Big George thinks about this, okay? He's going to talk about the recommendation. He's going to talk about some of the aggravating and mitigating factors, and he's going to explain again the unanimity of these votes and how it's always changing in Florida. So let's bring him in. All right, so we're back to discuss what Big George has to say about the recommendation of life, and the judge shall impose that life sentence without parole for Ronnie O'Neal. So tell us what you think of the verdict. Were you surprised? I know we both guessed that it was going to be death, and I think the main reason for that is if you're going to have a state with the death penalty, what case do you need to recommend death if not this case, right? That's what kind of went through my head. So tell me what you're thinking, and then explain again the unanimity of the decision making for the jury.
Well, I think this is a prime example of why the U.S. Supreme Court thinks the death penalty may be an arbitrary sentence.
Yeah, it may be out, because if you don't get it on this case, when are you going to get it?
Yeah, because you know that there are other cases that aren't this severe where the person got the death penalty. We don't know what the vote was in the jury. It could have been just one person finding that the mitigating circumstances outweighed the aggravating circumstances.
Or they could have just been against the death penalty. Or
Right.
something I mentioned was maybe one juror, because if you look at our live in the comments we saw, there were a lot of people that thought life in prison is worse than the death penalty. So maybe one juror felt like they were going to punish him more by making him go to prison for life without parole than the death.
Yeah.
They can make that decision. They can make that decision themselves. If they think that's worse and that's what they want to vote for, it's no longer unanimous.
And you know what else? Things you don't know. How do you know that maybe as a child one of those jurors weren't molested? And the fact that
That's
he
true.
was molested as a child really affected them. Something in their lives may have been similar to this man's life, and therefore they were really affected by it, and it became a huge mitigating circumstance for him.
Okay, so why don't you talk about what did you think? Were you surprised at all by it? Like, what are your overall thoughts?
So I'm never surprised by a recommendation of life, honestly, because I think a death recommendation is so hard to get. It's pretty rare, and therefore it's 12 people agreeing that someone needs to be killed because of his actions is hard to do. So it doesn't surprise me, although in this case I thought that they had everything they needed for the death penalty, and so
And based on how quick they came and the guilty across the board, all that indicated that they were going to be as harsh as possible.
Sure, and not just that, again, when we talked before, some of those guilty verdicts showed unanimity with regards to an aggravating circumstance.
So talk a little bit about that. So just because they went through the aggravating circumstances and the
Yes.
aggravating factors, and they were unanimous in thinking that those aggravating factors made him eligible for the death penalty. They decided that. They said he was absolutely eligible. We need to make this decision because these aggravating factors are bad enough. But then when the verdict came down, do the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors to where you're going to recommend death? The answer was no. They couldn't answer that yes unanimously. So explain a little, just me saying it again is confusing. The way this law is written up is confusing. So explain a little bit more about that, and a little bit more about the confusion of what has to be unanimous, what doesn't, and why.
Well, the confusion really starts with the Florida Supreme Court, in that they originally in 2016 said it had to be unanimous recommendation. And the Florida legislature passed a law consistent with that. And then in 2020 it said, whoops, we were wrong, and it does not have to be unanimous for a death recommendation. It has to be unanimous for an aggravating circumstance to justify death. The Florida legislature said, well, we're going to change the law, but they haven't changed the law. So as we sit here today, because of the statute, not because of the Florida Supreme Court, because the statute says unanimous for the recommendation, that's what they had to go by today. Saw what the judge did when he read the verdict form. She said, she went through all these things. Aggravating circumstance, were unanimous. Yes. On heinous, they were unanimous. On violent prior conviction, they were unanimous. On victim under 12, they were unanimous. Under vulnerable victim, they were unanimous. Do these aggravating circumstances justify death? Yes. Is your recommendation death because you have a unanimous recommendation? No.
So all of those decisions had to be unanimous.
Yes.
Right? Except for the no. I mean, that's where it's confused. The no does not have to be unanimous. It just has to be less than unanimous for death for that answer to be no.
Correct.
Right? So we're doing the best we can to explain
11,
it, but there's a lot of
11 to 1 means that's a no on the death recommendation. Even if 11 people
11 to
voted
1
for it.
yes. 11 to 1 yes votes means no.
Right.
Which doesn't make any sense, but you understand kind of the process at this point and how we got to where we're at. So what does this do as far as just projecting his appeals? What's going to happen now? He doesn't have that mandatory appeal. He doesn't go to death row, right?
Right.
So what happens now to Ronnie O'Neal?
Well, now he'll do the regular appellate process. In Tampa, it goes to the Second District Court of Appeals. The Second District Court of Appeals then will rule on whether or not it was they'll rule, by the way, both ways: the sentence and the conviction.
Guilt phase.
That's not going to happen. It's just going to be an appellate of the guilty verdict.
Right.
I mean, that's just a practical
Right.
thing. And an interesting point: the Poole case, which is the 2020 case that changed it from a unanimous recommendation that the legislature hasn't enacted yet. That Supreme Court case, that guy got the death penalty on an 11 to 1 vote. The recommendation was death by 11, 1 not for death. However, because the statute at that time was not a unanimous statute, he is on death row. I know it's complicated, but
yeah.
yeah.
Well, we don't need to dive into that anymore. But all we need to know for this case and for Ronnie O'Neal is that he did not get the death penalty. He got life without parole by a non-unanimous jury vote. So we'll keep an eye on this. If you guys have any more questions, leave them in the comments. Please like this video. Make sure you subscribe to our page and let us know what cases currently you want to hear us break down next. So thanks for being with us. Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.